She found the Duke's portrait covered in dust, until a hidden note beneath it changed everything she knew. The manor stood as a monument to silence. Rotherford House, seat of the Dukes of Rotherford for 3 centuries, had surrendered to dust and shadow in the years since the death of the Duchess. Marian Ellsworth moved through the abandoned corridors with measured steps, her grey-green eyes cataloguing each piece of neglected furniture, each portrait that had faded beneath veils of cobweb and time. The autumn light filtered weakly through tall windows, and the floorboards creaked beneath her sensible leather shoes, a sound that seemed to echo the estate's own melancholy. She had been engaged as a temporary steward of archives, a diplomatic phrasing that concealed the truth. The Duke of Rotherford had hired her to sort through the wreckage of his past, to make sense of what remained when grief had torn through a household like a tempest. The other servants whispered that the manor was cursed, that no woman would remain under its roof for longer than a season. Marian paid such talk no mind. She had spent her life being underestimated, first as the daughter of a provincial physician, then as a woman forced to earn her own bread through her competence with ledgers and documents. She did not expect to be beloved. She expected only to be useful. The portrait gallery occupied the eastern wing, a long room where the afternoon light pooled reluctantly upon polished floors. Here hung the likenesses of Rotherford dukes, each face rendered in oils and varnish, each gilded frame proclaiming ancestral authority. Marian had avoided this room until now, sensing that it held the heart of whatever wound had transformed the present duke into the dark, solitary man rumour painted him to be. But avoidance was a luxury she could not afford. The estate demanded cataloguing, and she was the instrument of that labour. It was the third portrait from the end that arrested her. A younger man looked out from the canvas, not yet the formidable creature she occasionally glimpsed in the estate's corridors, but someone whose eyes held a different quality, less guarded, less fractured. This must be the late Duke, the one whose death had cascaded into the present chaos. But no, the nameplate beneath was newly inscribed, Dorian Thane, Duke of Rotherford, Anno Domini, 1842. This was the current Duke, rendered in a moment before loss had rewritten his face. The portrait was obscured beneath a film of dust so thick it had taken on the texture of grey velvet. Marian moved close, her small frame dwarfed by the gilded expanse, and reached for the cleaning cloth she kept tucked in her apron pocket. The dust rose in small clouds as she worked, particulate sunlight dancing like aberrant spirits. She grew absorbed in her labour, in the gentle restoration of what time had tried to obliterate. As she lifted the cloth to wipe the frame's lower edge, something shifted. The portrait was mounted loosely upon its hooks, and her touch had disturbed it slightly. It tilted forward, enough to expose the wall behind it, and enough that something white, pale, deliberate, utterly incongruous with the dust and darkness, fell silently to the floorboards. Marian's breath caught. In the quiet of the gallery, the sound of paper striking wood seemed thunderous. She knelt, her grey skirts pooling around her, and retrieved what had fallen. It was a folded parchment, its edges yellowed with age, its surface marked with creases that suggested it had been folded and refolded many times. The vellum was fine, expensive, and the creases themselves seemed deliberate, purposeful, as though the parchment had been kept small enough to hide in the narrow space behind the portrait frame. A bookmark, perhaps, or something more intentional still. With trembling fingers, she could not say why they trembled, Marian unfolded it. The handwriting was elaborate, angular, and unmistakably masculine, but it was the first words that made her heart arrest completely in her chest. "If you ever find this, know that I never stopped loving you." Marian rose slowly to her feet, the parchment held before her as though it were an artifact of profound power. The afternoon light caught the edge of the paper, illuminating dust motes that swirled like small, aimless souls. Around her, the gallery fell into profound silence, so complete that she could hear the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall below, the whisper of wind against the tall windows, the sound of her own quickened breath. Someone had left a love letter behind a portrait. Someone, and the nameplate insisted it could only be the Duke himself, had written words of devotion and hidden them where only he, or someone who loved him enough to search, would find them. The question that bloomed in Marian's mind was not whether the letter was authentic. It was, to whom had these words been written, and why had they been concealed as though they were secrets too dangerous for daylight? She folded the parchment once more and held it carefully against her chest, her mind racing with the implications of what she had found. The dust motes continued their aimless waltz around her. The portrait of the younger Duke seemed to watch her with eyes that held far more compassion than the rumors of his present self suggested. In that moment, Marian Ellsworth understood that the true work of cataloguing Rotherford House was only beginning. The remainder of the afternoon passed in a state of anxious preoccupation. Marian had secured the letter in the leather-bound journal she carried for notes, her own private archive trusted to no one. She had returned the portrait to its hooks, adjusted it carefully to hide the evidence of its disturbance, and withdrawn from the gallery as though fleeing a shrine. The weight of the parchment against her ribs felt like an accusation or perhaps a confession. She took her evening meal alone in the small sitting room adjacent to her chamber, a modest space furnished with a single chair and a desk that served as her administrative post. The house seemed to settle around her as darkness encroached, timbers shifting, ancient pipes groaning their complaints, the peculiar symphony of an old estate preparing for night. Somewhere in the depths of the manor, she heard the footsteps of servants moving about their evening tasks. But there was no sound from the Duke's chambers. There never was. The Duke of Rotherford maintained his privacy with a ferocity that bordered on monastic. In the 3 weeks since her arrival, Marian had glimpsed him perhaps 4 times. Once in the estate office, where he had examined her work with an intensity that made her hands unsteady. Once in the library, where he had stood motionless before a shelf of unread volumes. And twice in the corridors, always moving with such purpose and such evident aversion to notice that she had learned to position herself to allow him passage without encounter. The servants spoke of him in whispers that carried the weight of both fear and speculation. A man broken by grief, a man who loved his wife to the point of madness, then found her death and could not be healed by all the physicians in England. A man who has withdrawn from society entirely, who refuses all invitations, who has become half ghost in his own ancestral home. The letter contradicted none of this, and yet it suggested something else entirely. That evening, Marian lay in her narrow bed and considered the possibilities. The handwriting was unquestionably masculine. The content spoke of a love so absolute, so all-consuming, that it demanded secrecy. If the Duke had written this letter to his wife, it was the most extraordinary testament to devotion she had ever encountered. But if that were true, why hide it? Why conceal such a declaration where it might never be found until after his own death? Unless the letter had not been written to his wife at all. The thought emerged with such force that Marian sat upright, her heart suddenly rapid. She groped for the candle on her nightstand and lit it, the small flame casting dancing shadows across the modest chamber. Her hands were trembling now, from cold or apprehension she could not determine. If the letter had been written to someone other than the Duchess, then it contained a secret of such magnitude that concealment became almost an act of mercy, a secret that could overturn reputations, that could reshape the family's standing in society, that could explain the Duke's present isolation with far greater depth than simple grief over his wife's death. But Marian was a woman of rational mind and careful judgment. She did not deal in speculation. She dealt in facts, in documented evidence, in the verifiable truth of numbers and records, and the only fact she possessed was this. A man had written words of profound love and hidden them away as though his life depended upon their remaining unknown. The next morning she resolved to approach the task of archival work with renewed purpose. If she was to understand this mystery, and increasingly she felt that understanding was not merely curiosity, but a kind of moral obligation, she would need to examine the documents themselves, the estate's records, the correspondence files, the household accounts from the years preceding the Duchess's death. The answer, if it existed, would be written somewhere in the dust and ink of Rotherford's history. She descended to the library with her journal and her determination, only to find young Edric Hale already at work among the shelves. The estate's librarian's apprentice looked up at her entrance, pushing his spectacles up the bridge of his nose. A gesture that Marian had learned preceded either a question or an apology. "Miss Ellsworth," he began, his voice carrying the careful deference of one who admired her intellect, whilst remaining uncertain of his place in relation to it. "I have located the household correspondence files from 1849 through 1851. I confess I have been unable to determine the proper order by which they should be catalogued. Perhaps your guidance would illuminate the matter?" Marian moved to the table where he had arranged the files, noting the care he had taken despite his evident confusion. Edric was a gentle creature, bookish and earnest, lacking the hardness that life on an estate typically demanded. She was not surprised that he had selected precisely the years that now consumed her interest. "These will do admirably," she said, and meant it. "We shall proceed chronologically, beginning with the earliest correspondence and proceeding toward the more recent. Such an approach will allow us to observe the evolution of household management across the period. It was not a lie. It was merely an incomplete truth. And in that moment, Marian Ellsworth understood that the simple act of finding a letter had already begun to compromise her certainty about the nature of truth itself. The letters revealed themselves slowly, like a palimpsest upon which the family's hidden struggles had been inscribed. Marian worked through them with methodical care, her eyes moving across pages written in the careful hand of the then-young Duke, or occasionally in the more florid script of his wife, the Duchess Margaret. The correspondence was domestic, largely unremarkable: requests for household accounts, instructions regarding the management of tenant farms, invitations to social functions that grew increasingly sparse as time advanced. But there were gaps. Marian noticed them because she had trained herself to notice absences as much as presences. Entire months were missing from the chronological sequence. There were letters dated August 1850, then nothing until November of that same year. A correspondence in January 1851 was followed by a 3-month void. She brought these gaps to Edric's attention as they worked together in the library's cool afternoon light. "There is a discontinuity in the record," she said, indicating the spaces where letters ought to have existed. "Do you suppose they have been misfiled, or might they have been removed from the collection entirely?" Edric leaned close, his young face furrowed with concentration. "I confess I cannot determine which, Miss Ellsworth. When I came to catalogue the collection some months past, these files were already in a state of considerable disorder. The previous librarian departed rather suddenly, if gossip among the servants holds truth." "On what grounds did he depart?" Marian asked carefully. "That, I am afraid, remains something of a mystery. The servants speak of it in whispers only. All I discerned was that he left without notice, and that his departure occurred some weeks after the Duchess's death. There was a sense—" Edric hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with repeating household speculation. There was a sense that something had happened, some circumstance that made his continued service untenable. Marian's mind moved swiftly through the implications. The library was an intimate space, one where correspondence would naturally be gathered and preserved. A librarian who had left suddenly in the wake of the Duchess's death, departing under circumstances clouded in mystery, might well have carried away or destroyed documents that revealed too much. It was not an uncommon practice among those who served great houses to protect the family's reputation by concealing what might shame them. She spent the remainder of that day examining the household accounts, searching for any anomaly that might suggest disruption or crisis. It was tedious labor, the kind that required absolute attention to detail, but Marian had always found peace in such work. Numbers did not lie. They could be misinterpreted, certainly, but they did not deceive with intentionality. It was in the accounts from September 1850 that she found it, a substantial withdrawal from the household fund, recorded in the Duke's own hand, but with no notation as to its purpose. The sum was considerable, enough to maintain a household for several months. The entry stood alone, surrounded by ordinary expenditures for household supplies and servants' wages, entirely without context. She marked the entry with a small pencil mark and continued her examination, but her mind had already begun to construct a narrative from fragments: a withdrawal of funds, missing correspondence, a librarian who fled, and beneath a portrait, a letter speaking of love in language so absolute that it could not possibly have been directed toward a wife whose presence had deteriorated into something the household accounts could not quite name, but whose absence they had begun to reflect. As the afternoon light began to fade, Marian became aware of a presence in the library, not announced, not heralded by the sound of servants or the creak of the great doors, but simply there. She turned from her work and found herself regarding the Duke himself, standing between the tall shelves of the library's western wall. He was taller than she had fully appreciated until this moment, when he stood in profile against the diminishing light from the windows. His shoulders bore the breadth of physical labor, his dark hair was somewhat disheveled as though he had run his hands through it repeatedly, and his expression held a quality of such profound intensity that Marian's breath caught. "Miss Ellsworth," he said, his voice deep and measured, each word carefully articulated, "I trust you are finding your work to be of interest." There was something in the question that transcended mere courtesy. It seemed to ask whether she was finding too much interest, whether she was beginning to perceive the truths that the estate had been constructed to conceal. "The work is most educational, Your Grace," she replied, keeping her voice steady despite the sudden rapid beating of her heart. The household records from recent years present a fascinating study in the management of an ancestral estate during a period of significant transition. His eyes, storm blue and fathomless, held hers for a moment that stretched like taffy pulled across time. Then he inclined his head, the faintest acknowledgement of her circumspection. "Proceed with your examination, Miss Ellsworth. Some truths I have learned must be discovered gradually, and only by those with the patience to seek them. The past yields its secrets reluctantly, and often only to those brave enough to look directly into its eyes." He departed as silently as he had arrived, leaving Marian standing among the ledgers, with the sensation that something profound had shifted in the architecture of the household, and that the Duke had just given her permission to continue her search for the meaning of the letter she carried. The evening following her encounter with the Duke, Marian did not sleep. She lay in the darkness of her chamber, the folded parchment pressed carefully between the pages of her journal, and allowed her mind to construct and reconstruct the narrative that the fragments of evidence were beginning to suggest. The withdrawal of funds, the missing correspondence, the librarian's sudden departure, the letter itself, with its declaration of a love so consuming that it demanded concealment even from the world at large. By dawn, she had formulated a course of action. If the missing letters had been removed from the official collection, they might yet exist elsewhere. The servants' quarters, perhaps, the private chambers of the Duke himself, or, and this thought came with a flush of both trepidation and purpose, they might have been secured in some place of safety, hidden away as the portrait letter had been hidden. She began her day as she always did, with breakfast in the small sitting room, and then a descent into the library, where Edric was already at work, his spectacles catching the morning light as he arranged freshly discovered documents. But instead of immediately joining him in the cataloguing labor, Marian approached the matter from a different angle. "Edric," she said carefully, "when the previous librarian departed, did he leave any records of his own work? Any index or notation system that might illuminate the organization of these files?" The young man looked troubled, as though the question itself constituted a breach of household propriety. "There was a journal, Miss Ellsworth, his personal record of the cataloguing efforts. It remains in the librarian's office, though no one has disturbed it since his departure. The Duke has made it clear that no one is to touch it." Marian's heart quickened. "Might I examine it? Purely for the purposes of understanding the previous system of organization, you understand. It would facilitate my own work considerably." Edric hesitated, his fingers worrying at the edge of a letter. "I should not presume to grant permission in such a matter. It would be proper to seek the Duke's authorization." Of course it would be. Propriety demanded it. And yet something in the Duke's parting words, "Some truths must be discovered gradually, and only by those brave enough to look directly into its eyes," suggested that perhaps he anticipated her discovery. Perhaps he had even facilitated it. "You are quite right," Marian conceded. "I shall request the Duke's permission directly. There is no purpose served by circumventing proper channels." But as it happened, the Duke himself resolved the matter before she could formulate a request. That afternoon, as Marian was returning to her chamber to change her dress for dinner, she found a small wooden key resting upon her pillow. No note accompanied it. No explanation was offered. But the key's shape was distinctive, and she recognized it immediately as matching the lock upon the librarian's office door, a space she had observed but never entered in her weeks of employment. She secured the key in her pocket, her hands steady though her pulse had begun to race with the peculiar intensity of transgression sanctioned by authority. That evening, after the household had settled into its customary silence, she made her way through the corridors with her candle held before her, casting dancing shadows upon walls that seemed to watch her passage with an almost sentient awareness. The librarian's office was a small room adjacent to the main library, furnished with a desk, several shelves of reference works, and a locked cabinet. The key opened the cabinet's door with a satisfying click, revealing within a leather-bound journal and several bundles of letters bound with faded ribbon, precisely the correspondence that was missing from the official collection. Marian's hands trembled as she lifted the journal and opened it to the final entries, dated mere days before the librarian's departure. The handwriting was agitated, the letters pressed hard into the paper, as though the pen itself were an instrument of anguish. The truth can no longer be borne in silence. What I have witnessed, what I have been asked to conceal, violates every principle of honor and decency. The letters I have hidden speak of a love so profound, so absolutely contrary to the narrative the family has constructed, that their exposure would remake the very foundation upon which this household stands. Yet I cannot be the instrument of such devastation. I have removed the correspondence and hidden it as instructed, but I cannot serve a house built upon such fundamental dishonesty. I depart this day, my conscience both relieved and shattered. Marian sank into the office chair, the journal still open before her, her mind struggling to accommodate the implications of what she was reading. A love so contrary to the family's narrative. What love could possibly be so transgressive, so absolutely impossible within the rigid structures of aristocratic society, that it would demand such comprehensive concealment? With trembling fingers, she untied the ribbon that bound the letters. The first was dated August 1850, and the handwriting was unmistakably the Duke's. My dearest, most beloved, how am I to reconcile what I feel with what society demands I become? Every moment spent in her presence feels like a betrayal of the absolute truth that burns within my heart. You alone know the man I am beneath the title, beneath the expectations. You alone see me as I truly am. How much longer must I bear this double existence? How much longer can my heart remain divided between duty and devotion? Marian's breath came shallow and quick. The implications were unfolding like a map of a landscape she had never imagined. The Duke had been writing to someone other than his wife, someone he loved with a passion that transcended his marriage itself, and that someone, the recipient of all these hidden letters, must have been a figure so impossible, so absolutely outside the boundaries of acceptable society, that even concealment had not been deemed sufficient protection. She gathered the letters carefully, securing them against her chest, and returned to her chamber. The night stretched before her like an ocean, and in its depths swam questions that demanded answers she was only beginning to understand how to seek. The letters spanned nearly 18 months, and in their accumulated testimony lay the complete anatomy of a forbidden love. Marian read through them systematically, page after page, until the Duke's devotion emerged as a thing both noble and destructive in equal measure. She read of his attempts to fulfill his duty as a husband, whilst simultaneously burning with a passion that made every moment of pretense feel like a descent into falsehood. She read of stolen moments, of looks exchanged across crowded rooms that conveyed entire conversations. She read of a love that had become the defining tragedy of his existence. But the most singular revelation came in a letter dated March 1851, written in handwriting that was less controlled than the previous entries, as though the writer had been in considerable emotional distress. I have just learned that she is with child. My wife announces it as though it were a triumph, as though the succession is secured and duty has been properly discharged. And I, God forgive me, I felt only despair, for in bringing a child into this world, she has bound me more irrevocably to a lie than ever before. I cannot abandon my post now. I cannot betray my vows now. Yet neither can I continue to exist as I have been existing. A man divided against himself, consumed by a passion that has no legitimate place in the world as it is constituted. The letter ended abruptly, as though the writer had set down his pen in defeat. Marian understood with a clarity that felt almost like clairvoyance that something had broken in the Duke at this point. Something fundamental had fractured, and the subsequent silence, the missing letters from the gaps in the collection, likely represented the period in which he had withdrawn from correspondence altogether, perhaps attempting to master his emotions through sheer force of will. The next letter in the collection was dated nearly 6 months later, in September of that year, and its tone had changed entirely. It was not a love letter, but rather something far more complex, a farewell written in the language of absolute renunciation. I have made my decision, though it costs me every particle of happiness my life contains. I have resolved to commit myself fully to the role into which I was born, to suppress the truth that burns within me, to become the man that society requires me to be, rather than the man I truly am. This is not nobility. I harbor no illusions about that. This is merely the price of survival in a world that would rather see me destroyed than accommodate the truth of what I am. I am extinguishing the lamp of hope. I am choosing darkness because it is the only honorable path remaining to me. Forgive me. Forgive me for being too weak to live openly. Forgive me for choosing safety over truth. Forgive me for loving you. Marian sat back from the letters, her eyes burning with unshed tears. The tragedy was suddenly, devastatingly clear. The Duke had chosen to abandon the love that had sustained him. He had chosen to become a faithful, if grieving, husband. And then, and this was the cruelest particular of all, the Duchess had died, freeing him from his vows, only to trap him instead within the prison of his own grief and the absolute impossibility of revealing the truth without destroying both their memories. The portrait letter, she now understood, had been written after the Duchess's death. It was not addressed to anyone in particular, or rather it was addressed to the universe itself, to the memory of the person he had loved and renounced, a final testament that no living soul was meant to hear. It was a ghost speaking to other ghosts. She was so absorbed in this comprehension that she did not hear the knock upon her chamber door until it came a second time, more insistent. She rose swiftly, securing the letters within her journal, and opened the door to find one of the housemaids, young Martha, standing in the corridor with an expression of anxious urgency. "Begging your pardon, Miss Ellsworth," the girl said, dropping a curtsy, "but there is a visitor arrived for the Duke. A lady, Miss Ellsworth, Lady Honoria Blackwell, the cousin from the south, and she has been asking questions about you, Miss Ellsworth, about your position here and the nature of your work. There is talk below stairs, Miss Ellsworth, concerning talk, if I may be so bold." Marian's stomach tightened. She had been dimly aware of the existence of Lady Honoria, the Duke's widowed cousin, a woman of considerable social standing and, if gossip held truth, of equally considerable influence over her brother's affairs. Such a woman would hardly regard with indifference the presence of a middle-class woman of unknown family installed within the household. "What manner of talk, Martha?" she asked carefully. The maid's face flushed with the discomfort of imparting gossip to the subject of it. "That you are ambitious, Miss Ellsworth. That you have used your position to ingratiate yourself with the Duke's favour. That you are a woman of questionable virtue, seeking to take advantage of a gentleman's grief." The accusations hung in the air between them, familiar and vicious in equal measure. Marian had lived long enough in a world that suspected educated women of predatory intent to recognize the pattern of such insinuation. Lady Honoria, it appeared, had arrived with the explicit purpose of questioning her presence and likely of removing her from it. "Thank you for the warning, Martha," Marian said quietly. "You may inform the household that I remain committed to my duties. That is all the answer anyone requires." But as she closed the door, she pressed the journal containing the letters against her heart and understood that the sanctuary of Rotherford House had become, quite suddenly, a place of considerable danger. Lady Honoria Blackwell was precisely the woman that Marian's imagination had constructed. Tall, elegant, impeccably dressed in deep burgundy silk that proclaimed both wealth and taste. Her dark hair was arranged in elaborate coils, and her expression held the particular confidence of a woman accustomed to absolute obedience from those beneath her station. She received Marian the following morning in the drawing-room, a space that ordinarily remained shuttered and unused, now illuminated with purposeful brightness that seemed designed to expose rather than to welcome. "Miss Ellsworth," Lady Honoria began, her voice pitched with the sort of graciousness that masked absolute malice, "I have been most curious to make your acquaintance. My cousin speaks so little of his household arrangements that I confess I was quite surprised to discover a woman of genteel upbringing installed in this capacity. Most unusual." "I am grateful for the position, Lady Honoria," Marian replied, maintaining perfect composure whilst seated rigidly in a chair that seemed designed to underscore the distinction between visitor and employee. "The Duke has been most gracious in allowing me to pursue my work. Yes, I understand you have access to the private papers and correspondence of this household, a responsibility of considerable sensitivity." Lady Honoria's eyes, grey and sharp as flint, examined Marian with obvious intention to intimidate. One might wonder at the wisdom of entrusting such matters to someone whose family connections are, shall we say, modest. There is always a risk, you understand, when a young woman of questionable background is granted access to the intimate details of a great house, particularly when that young woman has no family of standing to ensure her discretion. The insinuation was subtle but comprehensive. Marian's lack of family connections was being weaponized as evidence of her untrustworthiness. Her youth was being reframed as evidence of predatory intent. Her very presence in the household was being suggested as an act of calculated seduction. "My work concerns itself solely with the cataloguing of historical documents and the organization of household records," Marian said calmly. "I assure you, Lady Honoria, that I harbor no interests beyond the proper execution of my duties." "How commendably stated," Lady Honoria replied, rising from her seat with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to absolute deference. "Yet I find myself somewhat concerned regarding the reputation that might accrue to this household from the continued presence of a young woman in such close proximity to my cousin. The servants, you understand, are prone to speculation, and scandal, once begun, becomes exceedingly difficult to contain. I have ventured to suggest to the Duke that it would be far more prudent to conclude your engagement and to ensure that no further occasion for speculation should arise." Marian's heart had begun to beat with a sharp, irregular rhythm, but her voice remained steady. "I shall, naturally, defer to the Duke's decision in the matter. I am here at his pleasure, and if he should determine that my services are no longer required, I shall depart with my reputation and my honor intact." Something flickered across Lady Honoria's face, a moment of surprise, perhaps, at the absolute certainty in Marian's response. The woman had clearly anticipated either submission or defensiveness, not this quiet confidence. But as quickly as it had appeared, the expression was masked again beneath layers of aristocratic civility. "How admirably resigned you are," Lady Honoria observed. "I do hope my cousin will see the wisdom of protecting both his standing and his household from any further complication. Good morning, Miss Ellsworth." She departed with the satisfaction of a woman who had delivered a blow that she believed to be fatal, leaving Marian alone in the drawing-room with the absolute certainty that the threat had been issued and that the Duke would be obliged to respond to it. The remainder of the day unfolded in a state of heightened tension. Marian performed her duties with meticulous attention, but her mind was occupied entirely with the question of what the Duke would do. The social world in which he moved operated according to strict codes of propriety. Lady Honoria, as his widow cousin and a woman of considerable standing, wielded genuine power over his reputation. If she chose to insinuate that Marian was a woman of loose virtue, the narrative would spread through the country like infection through an open wound. By evening, Marian had resolved that she would resign her position voluntarily. Such action would deprive Lady Honoria of the satisfaction of her removal, and would perhaps spare the Duke from the necessity of choosing between his honor and the woman who had begun to occupy an increasingly significant place in his consciousness. It was the noble choice, the honorable one, the decision that a woman of true virtue would make without hesitation. She had composed the letter of resignation in her mind and was preparing the materials for its written form when there came a soft knock upon her chamber door. She opened it to find Edric standing in the corridor, his spectacles slightly askew, his young face alight with something between excitement and trepidation. "Miss Ellsworth," he said urgently, "the Duke requests your presence in the library. He says the matter is of considerable urgency and that you are to come at once." The library at night held a quality entirely distinct from its daytime aspect. The gaslight had been lit, casting a warm amber glow across the shelves and creating pools of shadow in the corners where the illumination could not fully penetrate. The Duke stood near the great desk, his tall frame silhouetted against the lamplight, and as Marian entered, he turned to regard her with an intensity that made her breath catch. His storm blue eyes held something she had not seen in them before, a quality of absolute vulnerability, as though he had stripped away every layer of reserve and stood before her without artifice or protection. "Miss Ellsworth," he said, his voice deep and measured, each word carefully articulated, "I trust you will forgive the irregular hour of this summons. There are matters that require our discussion, and I have found that night provides a sanctuary in which truth may be spoken more freely than daylight permits." Marian entered the library fully, allowing the door to close softly behind her. The impropriety of the situation was not lost upon her. A young unmarried woman alone with a gentleman in his private study, at an hour when propriety dictated that all respectable women should be in their chambers. Yet she moved forward without hesitation, for she understood intuitively that whatever the Duke had to communicate transcended the trivial concerns of social convention. "I am aware of my cousin's visit," he continued, moving to stand before the great fireplace where a fire burned in defiance of the autumn evening's relative mildness. "I am aware of the insinuations she has made regarding your character and your presence within this household. I am aware, moreover, that you have likely resolved to resign your position rather than subject this house to the scandal that her malice threatens to manufacture." Marian found that she could not speak. The accuracy of his perception was disarming. "You possess a nobility of character," the Duke said, still not turning to regard her directly. "That is exceedingly rare in this world. The instinct to sacrifice yourself for the honor of others is admirable, and it is precisely because of that nobility that I cannot allow you to depart. For to do so would be to permit a lie to stand unchallenged, and lies, Miss Ellsworth, have already done sufficient damage within these walls." He turned then, and the expression on his face was such that Marian felt as though the very foundations of her understanding were shifting beneath her feet. His eyes glistened with the moisture of profound emotion, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute sincerity. "You have discovered the letters," he said. "It was not a question. You have uncovered the history that this household has taken such pains to conceal, and I suspect, though you have said nothing, that you have begun to comprehend the nature of what I have endured, the impossible division between what I was required to be and what I truly am." "Your Grace," Marian began, but he raised a hand to silence her. "Allow me to speak, I beg you, for I have been silent for so many years that the words have accumulated like pressure behind a dam, and if I do not release them now, I fear they will destroy me entirely." He moved to the desk and positioned himself against it, his great frame somehow diminished by the weight of what he was about to reveal. "The person to whom I wrote those letters was a man. He was the son of a neighboring landowner, a man of education and sensibility, who saw in me something beyond the title and the expectation. For a brief, shining moment in my life, I knew what it was to be loved for the man I truly am, rather than the position I inhabit." The confession hung in the air between them, carrying with it the accumulated shame and anguish of years. Marian understood, with sudden and crystalline clarity, why the Duke had ordered the letters concealed, why the previous librarian had fled in distress, why the woman sitting before her carried the weight of a secret so absolute that its exposure would not merely compromise his reputation, it would destroy him entirely in the eyes of a society that could countenance no such thing. "When I learned that my wife was with child," the Duke continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "I understood that I had reached the end of what I could bear. I made my choice. I renounced the person I loved. I committed myself to the role that society demanded I fulfill, and I believed, God forgive me, I believed, that this sacrifice would purchase some measure of peace, some small reconciliation between the man I was and the man I was required to be." "Your Grace," Marian said softly, "you have endured a suffering of such magnitude that I confess I scarcely know how to comprehend it, but I must ask, why have you chosen to reveal this to me? Why risk the exposure of a secret that has been guarded so carefully?" The Duke's eyes met hers, and in them she saw something that made her heart falter within her chest. "Because," he said, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of a man who had finally arrived at a truth he could no longer deny, "your discovery of that letter was not accident. It was providence. The universe, God, if you prefer the term, has placed you in this house and guided you to this knowledge for a purpose. And that purpose is not the destruction of my reputation, but rather the possibility of redemption. For in your presence, Miss Ellsworth, in your quiet dignity and your capacity for understanding, I have been given a glimpse of what my life might yet become. I have been shown, however briefly, a vision of a future in which I need not live divided against myself." He stepped forward, and his hand extended toward her, palm upward, in a gesture that transcended the boundaries of propriety and touched something far more profound. "I am asking you not to resign," he said. "I am asking you to remain, and I am asking you, if you possess even a fraction of the courage that your actions have demonstrated, to allow me the honor of knowing you, not as an employee, not as a woman hired to organize papers and manage records, but as a woman whose presence has already begun to transform the landscape of my existence." Marian's hand rose as though independent of her conscious will, and in that moment, as her fingers touched his, she understood that every event, every discovery, every instance of apparent chance had led her inexorably to this precise point in time, this exact convergence of two souls who had both learned to live without hope and who had now been given an opportunity to learn, together, what hope might truly mean. The morning brought a cascade of consequences that neither Marian nor the Duke could have fully anticipated. The news of Marian's continued employment, coupled with the Duke's explicit endorsement of her position and his pointed dismissal of his cousin's objections, spread through the household like wildfire. Lady Honoria, affronted and outmaneuvered, departed the estate with barely concealed fury, her dignity maintained only by the thinnest veneer of aristocratic composure. But her departure created a void that was rapidly filled with speculation and whispered commentary from the servants, each interpretation more elaborate than the last. The Duke, however, had anticipated this, and he moved with deliberate intention to reshape the narrative. That afternoon he summoned the household, every servant from the highest steward to the youngest scullery maid, to gather in the great hall. Marian stood beside him as he addressed them, her position at his side itself, a statement more eloquent than words could manage. "I am aware," he began, his voice resonating through the vast chamber with absolute authority, "that there has been speculation regarding Miss Ellsworth's role within this household and the nature of my regard for her. I am here to make my position absolutely clear. Miss Ellsworth is engaged in work of considerable importance to this estate. Her competence, her discretion, and her character are beyond reproach. Any suggestion to the contrary will not be tolerated, and the individual responsible for spreading such calumny will find themselves dismissed without reference. Am I understood?" The assembled servants nodded their acknowledgement, though Marian could see in their eyes that the Duke's pronouncement, rather than settling the matter, had merely transformed the speculation into something more complex and infinitely more interesting. The whispers would continue, but now they would carry the weight of the Duke's implicit acknowledgement that something significant had shifted in the household's dynamics. Over the following days, an unspoken routine established itself. The Duke would find reasons to consult with Marian regarding the archival work. They would discuss the household records in careful, formal language, but beneath that formality ran an undercurrent of profound connection that needed no articulation. He would stand close to her as she explained the organization of documents, and she would feel the warmth of his presence like a physical force. When their hands touched, accidentally whilst passing papers, the contact seemed to carry a voltage that made ordinary speech feel inadequate. One evening, as autumn deepened toward winter and the nights grew long and bitter, the Duke found Marian in the library after all other occupants had retired to their chambers. She was cataloguing a particularly significant collection of household correspondence, working by lamplight in the quiet of the late hour. He approached without announcing himself, and she sensed his presence only when the air around her seemed to warm and thicken. "You work late," he observed, his voice carrying a quality of gentle concern. "There is a great deal of work to accomplish," Marian replied, though she did not turn to regard him. To do so would be to acknowledge the particular intimacy of the moment, and she was not yet certain she possessed the courage required for such acknowledgement. "The household's history demands to be properly preserved." "Yes," he said softly, and she heard in his voice the recognition that they were speaking of something far larger than the management of documents. "History demands to be preserved, and truth demands to be honored. Do you know what I was thinking when I saw you that first day standing before the portrait gallery?" She turned then, unable to resist the pull of his presence any longer. He stood slightly above her, silhouetted against the library's gentle gaslight, his dark hair falling slightly across his forehead, his expression open and vulnerable in a way that seemed to strip away years of carefully maintained reserve. "I was thinking," he continued, "that the universe had finally taken pity upon a man who had spent his entire life living as a lie. I was thinking that perhaps, just perhaps, there remained the possibility of redemption, of transformation, of becoming something more than the sum of my obligations and my shame." He extended his hand to her, and when she took it, he drew her gently to her feet. They stood in the quiet library, surrounded by the accumulated history of generations, and the moment seemed to exist outside of ordinary time, suspended in a space where truth could be spoken without fear of consequence. "I know what society will say," he said, his thumb moving gently across the back of her hand in a gesture of such tenderness that it made her heart ache with longing. "I know what they will invent and fabricate and whisper when they learn that a man of my reputation and my station has chosen to build his life around a woman who has no family, no title, no claim to the elevated position she now occupies. I know that I am asking you to accept a position that will be difficult and sometimes painful, but I am also offering you something that I believe is worth the price of that difficulty." "And what is that, Your Grace?" she asked, though she already knew the answer, for it was written in the intensity of his gaze and the careful restraint with which he held her hand. "A life built upon truth," he said simply. "A partnership founded not upon duty or obligation or the requirements of society, but upon a genuine and absolute recognition of each other as we truly are. I am asking you, Miss Ellsworth, if you would permit me the honor of knowing you, truly knowing you, for all the remaining years of my life." The words hung between them like a vow, and Marian understood that she stood at a precipice. To accept what he was offering, was to accept a future marked by scandal and social ostracism and the constant judgment of a world that could not possibly understand. To refuse was to abandon the first person who had ever seen her as more than merely competent, more than merely useful. She did what her heart, after years of discipline and self-suppression, had been longing to do. She raised herself slightly, and she kissed him, a gesture both tender and profound, a declaration that transcended words and carried within it all the accumulated longing of two souls who had finally found each other across the vast distances that life and society had constructed. The month that followed was unlike anything in Marian's experience. The Duke moved through the household with a lightness that those who had known him for years found almost incomprehensible. He began to participate once more in the life of the estate. He attended local assemblies, where his presence invariably caused a stir of speculation and subtle scandal. But he moved through such occasions with absolute indifference to the whispers and the pointed glances, his attention fixed entirely upon Marian, who stood at his side with the dignity of a woman who had learned that true worth could not be diminished by the opinions of those who did not understand her. Yet beneath this surface transformation, tension was building like pressure in a closed vessel. The scandal of their evident attachment was spreading through the county with alarming rapidity. The servants reported that bets were being placed in nearby villages regarding the nature of their relationship. Anonymous letters began arriving at the house, some congratulatory, others viciously condemnatory. The local vicar, uncertain how to proceed, consulted with various members of the aristocracy regarding whether the Duke's behavior constituted grounds for social censure. It was a letter that arrived on a morning of particular coldness that finally brought the crisis to its inevitable culmination. It bore the seal of the Duke's London solicitor, and when the Duke opened and read it, his expression underwent a transformation so dramatic that Marian, observing from across the breakfast table, felt her heart begin to race with apprehension. "What is it?" she asked softly. The Duke set the letter carefully upon the table, as though its contents were fragile enough to shatter under careless handling. "Lady Honoria has brought an action," he said quietly. "She has petitioned the court to declare me unfit to manage the estate on grounds of moral turpitude and degradation of the ducal dignity. She is arguing that my actions, my associations, she specifies, constitute grounds for legal intervention and the appointment of a conservator to manage the estate on behalf of the family." The implication was crystalline. Lady Honoria was not merely attempting to damage the Duke's reputation, she was moving to seize control of his property and his affairs, using his evident attachment to Marian as legal justification for declaring him incapable of rational judgment. "She cannot possibly succeed," Marian said, though even as the words left her mouth, she understood their naivete. The law was constructed to protect property and social order, and any evidence of behavior that seemed to threaten those foundations could be weaponized by those with sufficient standing. "Perhaps not," the Duke agreed, "but the process will be lengthy and exceedingly public. Every detail of my life, every aspect of our connection, will be exposed to examination by judges and lawyers and society at large. Your name will be associated with scandal. Your reputation will be destroyed beyond any possibility of redemption. And at the end of this process, even if I retain control of the estate, we will have purchased my freedom only through your absolute ruin." He rose from the table and moved to the window, his tall frame rigid with the weight of impossible choice. "I cannot ask you to endure such suffering," he said. "I cannot permit your life to be destroyed because of what I am and what I have chosen to become. I must ask you to consider whether you possess the courage to remain, truly remain, in the face of consequences that will be far more severe than either of us has yet fully acknowledged." The gauntlet had been laid before her, and Marian understood that this was the true test of everything that had transpired between them. She rose from her seat and moved to join him at the window, where the late autumn landscape spread before them in shades of grey and diminishing colour. Behind them, the library, that place that had become as much a part of her being as her own heartbeat, waited in patient silence. "Your Grace," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling that ran through her body, "I did not come to this house seeking safety or ease or the protection of unexamined reputation. I came seeking truth, and in seeking truth, I found you. The question you are asking me is whether I will abandon that truth now, when its cost has become apparent. And my answer is no. I will not abandon it. I will not abandon you. And I will face whatever consequences that loyalty demands, secure in the knowledge that a life built upon truth is infinitely more valuable than a life preserved through lies. The Duke turned to regard her, and in his eyes she saw the accumulation of years of solitude finally beginning to dissolve. He reached for her hand, and this time his touch carried no hesitation, no restraint, only the absolute certainty of a man who had finally found something worth fighting for, with every particle of strength he possessed. "Then we shall face this together," he said softly, "and I shall ensure that the world learns what I have learned, that the greatest act of courage is not the silent endurance of injustice, but the public assertion of truth, whatever price that assertion demands." The winter that descended upon Rotherford House arrived with the weight of absolute finality. Snow fell in thick, persistent layers, transforming the landscape into something otherworldly and removed from the ordinary commerce of human society. Within the estate, preparations for the legal proceedings intensified. The Duke's solicitors arrived from London with mountains of documents and counsel regarding the best strategy for defending against Lady Honoria's allegations. They were men of considerable experience and reputation, yet even they seemed somewhat daunted by the task before them, defending a man whose only real transgression was the assertion of his right to determine the course of his own heart. The Duke chose to fight not with obfuscation or clever legal maneuvers, but with absolute truth. Against the counsel of his solicitors, he resolved to attend the hearing in person and to submit himself to questioning regarding every aspect of his relationship with Marian. The solicitors protested vehemently, warning that such honesty could only provide ammunition to those who sought to destroy him, but the Duke was inexorable in his determination. "I have spent my entire life concealing truth," he told them, his voice carrying the weight of absolute resolve. "I will not spend what remains of my life doing the same. If I am to lose everything, it will be because I chose to be honest, not because I chose cowardice." During this period, Marian and the Duke established a pattern of extraordinary restraint. They did not permit themselves the luxury of unguarded affection within the household, understanding that any evidence of impropriety would be weaponized by those arrayed against them. Yet in the evenings, when the household had settled into sleep, they would meet in the library, and there, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of centuries, they would speak of futures both hopeful and terrifying, of loves that had been renounced and loves that might yet be claimed, of the absolute possibility that even in the face of catastrophe, two souls might find salvation in each other. It was during one such evening encounter that the Duke revealed something that transformed Marian's understanding of everything that had transpired. He produced from a locked cabinet within his study a portrait, not the one that hung in the gallery, but rather a smaller, more intimate rendering. It depicted a young man with sensitive features and intelligent eyes, and beneath it was inscribed a name, Thomas Ashford, 1828-1851. "He died," the Duke said simply, "in the spring following the winter in which I renounced him. An accident whilst riding, or so the official report claimed. I have sometimes wondered whether it was truly an accident, or whether he simply no longer possessed the will to live in a world that demanded he suppress everything that made him who he was." Marian regarded the portrait with profound compassion, understanding suddenly the absolute depth of the Duke's grief, the layers of loss that had accumulated within him across the years. Thomas Ashford's death had not merely been the loss of a beloved person, it had been the death of possibility itself, the absolute erasure of any hope that the Duke might one day be free to live openly as he truly was. "His family blamed me," the Duke continued. "They understood somehow the nature of our connection, and they understood that I had chosen to abandon him, to renounce him, to act as though the love we shared was merely the delusion of an unstable mind. I carried guilt for his death, as though I had wielded the reins that caused his horse to stumble, and in my guilt I built the fortress of solitude that I inhabited for so many years." "But you did not cause his death," Marian said gently. "You could not have prevented it. You could only have lived as you were required to live, within the constraints of a society that would have destroyed you, both had the truth been known." "Yes," the Duke agreed, "and yet knowing this intellectually has never quite erased the emotional truth that I abandoned him when he most needed me. But perhaps," he paused, regarding her with an intensity that made her breath catch, "perhaps the universe has offered me a second opportunity. Perhaps in finding you, in choosing to defend that choice with absolute honesty and courage, I am permitted to do for us what I could not do for him. I am permitted to insist that our love is not a transgression, but a truth, and that truth demands to be honored and protected." The legal proceedings commenced on a morning of particular bitterness, when the frost had crystallized the landscape into something resembling glass. The Duke and Marian traveled to the county courthouse, in a carriage adorned with the ducal crest, their arrival creating a sensation among those who had gathered in anticipation of the spectacle. The courtroom itself was crowded with observers, drawn by scandal and curiosity in equal measure. Lady Honoria sat at the plaintiff's table, her face arranged in an expression of grave concern that barely concealed her satisfaction. The Duke testified for the entirety of that day and into the next, describing with unflinching honesty every aspect of his life, his marriage, his grief, his discovery of Marian, the nature of their attachment. He acknowledged, without apology, the history that had preceded Marian's arrival at the estate. He described the letters and their contents, and he permitted them to be entered into evidence, understanding that their public exposure was the price of absolute vindication. When the solicitors for Lady Honoria attempted to frame his behavior as evidence of moral degradation and instability, the Duke responded with calm certainty. "My behavior," he stated, "reflects not a descent into degradation, but an ascent toward honesty. I have chosen to align my actions with my truth. This is not madness. It is the most sane and courageous decision I have made in my entire life." The magistrate, a man of considerable age and apparent wisdom, listened to every word with an expression of absolute neutrality, and when the proceedings finally concluded, he delivered his judgment with a clarity that seemed to acknowledge truths that transcended mere legal argument. "The question before this court," he stated, "is whether the defendant demonstrates sufficient competence and propriety to manage his estate and his affairs. After careful consideration of the evidence presented, this court finds that the Duke of Rotherford is entirely competent in every regard. Moreover, this court finds that the allegations brought against him constitute an abuse of process and a violation of personal liberty. The petition is hereby dismissed and the defendant is awarded costs against the plaintiff." As the gavel descended, Marian felt the weight of accumulated tension finally begin to release. The Duke had been vindicated, not merely in terms of legal standing, but in the far more profound sense of having his truth acknowledged as legitimate and valid by the apparatus of society itself. The aftermath of the legal victory unfolded with a peculiar mixture of triumph and transformation. The Duke emerged from the courthouse to find that society's narrative regarding him had undergone a subtle but comprehensive shift. Those who had whispered condemnation now found themselves compelled to acknowledge the courage required to defend one's truth so publicly. The newspapers, sensing a story of redemptive power and moral courage, began to report on the case in terms that highlighted not scandal, but transformation. Yet the Duke's primary concern was not society's approval, but rather the matter that had been occupying his private thoughts since the moment he first understood that Marian Ellsworth had become as essential to his existence as breath itself. Within the week following the conclusion of the legal proceedings, he summoned Marian to his study, a space that had become peculiarly intimate despite its formal furnishings and its position at the heart of administrative authority. She found him standing before the great desk, and beside him lay a small velvet box of deep crimson. When she entered, he turned to regard her with an expression so suffused with love that she felt her heart might quite literally cease its function. "Miss Ellsworth," he began, his voice carrying a tremor that she had never before heard, the tremor of absolute vulnerability and absolute hope existing simultaneously. "You have endured much for the sake of truth. You have sacrificed your reputation, your security, your standing in society, all for the sake of standing beside a man whose past was marked by concealment and whose present is marked by scandal. I am aware that I have asked far too much of you, and yet I find myself about to ask something more." He opened the velvet box, revealing a ring of extraordinary beauty, not a fashionable diamond, but rather a deep green stone set in gold, chosen with evident intention. "This stone belonged to my mother," he said softly. "She gave it to me before her death with instructions that I was to place it upon the hand of a woman who understood that true nobility exists not in title or inheritance, but in the courage to defend truth against all opposition. I did not understand her meaning at the time. I understand it now." He withdrew the ring and extended it toward her, and as he did, he lowered himself to one knee, a gesture so contrary to his nature, to the nature of a man of his station and pride, that Marian understood it as the complete annihilation of every barrier that had previously existed between them. "Marian Ellsworth," he said, his voice steady now despite the profound emotion that animated it, "will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Not out of obligation, not out of duty, not out of any requirement of society, but because you love the man I truly am, and because you have granted me the inestimable gift of permitting me to love you openly and without reservation." Marian found that she could not speak. Her hands trembled, her eyes burned with tears that she could no longer suppress, and every coherent thought in her mind seemed to have dissolved into pure emotion. She raised him to his feet, and she kissed him, a gesture so profound, so absolute in its declaration of her answer, that words became entirely superfluous. The wedding took place in the spring, when the gardens of Rotherford House had burst into blossom, and the world seemed to have been renewed through the simple passage of seasons. It was a quiet ceremony, conducted in the chapel at the estate with only the household staff and a few trusted friends as witnesses. The local vicar, after considerable internal struggle, consented to perform the service, having concluded that whatever else might be said about the Duke, he was a man of genuine moral conviction and authentic transformation. But the most significant moment came not during the formal proceedings, but rather in the private chamber where Marian prepared for her wedding. The Duke presented her with a gift, a frame beautifully crafted and set in silver, containing 2 items, the pressed vellum bookmark that she had discovered behind his portrait, and beside it, a new letter written in his hand. "My dearest love, when I concealed the first of these letters behind my portrait, I did so believing that no living person would ever read the truth of my heart. I believed that such truths were meant to remain silent, locked away in the darkness where they could harm no one. But you have taught me something that transformed my existence. That truth, when finally spoken, does not destroy, it liberates. You have given me the extraordinary gift of being able to love openly, without shame, without concealment. In doing so, you have not merely changed my life, you have redeemed it. We begin today as husband and wife, but I wish to mark it by placing beside the old letter a new one, so that all who come after us will understand that love, defended publicly and with absolute courage, is not a scandal or a shame. It is the highest expression of human nobility. I love you, Marian, not despite the cost of that love, but because you have made the cost worth paying. For all the remaining days of my life, and perhaps beyond, your devoted husband, Dorian." 5 years had transformed Rotherford House into something that those who had known it in its period of desolation could scarcely have recognized. The great rooms that had stood shuttered and silent now blazed with light and resonated with laughter. The gardens, which had been permitted to fall into a state of romantic ruin, had been carefully restored whilst maintaining much of their wild beauty. And the library, that sacred space where truth had been discovered and defended, had become a repository not merely of the family's history, but of a transformed understanding of what family itself might mean. Marian, now the Duchess of Rotherford, moved through the estate with a grace that her years of quiet competence had thoroughly prepared her for, yet which transcended mere administrative capability. She had undertaken a project of profound personal significance, the compilation and publication of the household archives, organized in such a manner as to tell not merely the factual history of the ducal line, but the deeper human story, the struggles, the losses, the unexpected triumphs that lay beneath the surface of aristocratic pretense. The publication had created a minor sensation in literary circles. That a woman of no family distinction should have compiled such a comprehensive and brilliantly organized account of a great house was remarkable enough. That she should have done so with such honesty, such willingness to acknowledge the complexity and even the contradictions inherent in human experience, elevated the work beyond mere genealogical documentation into something approaching genuine literature. Yet it was on a particular evening in early spring, 5 years after that transformative day, when Marian had discovered the portrait letter, that the true significance of her labor became apparent. She and the Duke had been invited to London, to a gathering of considerable social prominence. The Duchess of Rotherford, it was widely acknowledged, had become something of a phenomenon, a woman of humble origins who had captured the heart of one of England's most formidable aristocrats, and in doing so had somehow transformed not merely her own life, but the life of her husband and, by extension, the very household that bore his name. But the moment that truly crystallized the magnitude of their collective transformation came when they encountered, at a reception, the widow of the man who had been the Duke's first love. Mrs. Thomas Ashford had read Marian's account of the household archives, and she had requested an introduction. When the moment came, the woman embraced them both with tears streaming down her face. "I have waited 25 years to hear these truths spoken," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. I have carried my husband's memory in silence, believing that the love he felt for your husband was a shameful thing that must be concealed even from my own children. But through your work, Your Grace, she said, directing her attention to Marian, I have been granted the extraordinary gift of understanding that the love my husband felt was not shameful, it was beautiful, it was real, it was worthy of honor. You have given me permission to mourn him, not with shame, but with pride. The Duke, standing beside his wife with his hand resting gently upon her back, felt something release within him that he had not quite acknowledged was still held in tension. The ghosts of the past would never entirely be laid to rest. Grief of such profound nature could never be completely exorcised, but they could be honored. They could be integrated into a new narrative that did not demand their erasure as the price of moving forward. That evening, as they returned to their hotel chambers in London, the Duke drew Marian close to him, his tall frame enclosing hers in warmth and security. You have done an extraordinary thing, he said softly, his lips moving against her hair, not merely by the work itself, but by insisting that truth, all truth, even the uncomfortable and difficult truth, deserves to be honored and acknowledged. You have given voice to those who were forced into silence. You have given dignity to loves that society deemed unworthy of dignity. You have transformed this house, and in doing so, you have transformed the world. I have only done what seemed necessary, Marian replied, but she smiled as she spoke, understanding the profound truth beneath his words. For she had indeed done something that transcended mere documentation. She had insisted through her labor and her presence, and her absolute refusal to permit truth to be concealed, that love itself, in all its forms, in all its complexity, deserved to be defended and honored as the highest expression of human dignity. The years that followed would bring further transformations. The Duke and Duchess would become known within certain circles as champions of a new kind of honesty, not the brutal, invasive honesty that sought to shame and destroy, but rather the courageous honesty that acknowledged human complexity and defended the right of individuals to determine their own lives in accordance with their own truths. Their household became a refuge for artists, writers, and thinkers who had been marginalized by society's rigid structures. The library expanded to include works that challenged conventional wisdom. And Rotherford House, once a monument to grief and concealment, became something far more valuable, a sanctuary where truth could be spoken and lives could be honestly lived. Marian bore the Duke 2 children, a son and a daughter, and both inherited their mother's intellectual acuity and their father's passionate commitment to justice and authenticity. The family line that had seemed to be ending in isolation and bitterness was renewed with purpose and meaning, but more than that, the example they set, of a love that had been defended publicly, of truth that had been asserted despite the cost, of individuals who had chosen integrity over comfort, resonated far beyond the boundaries of their own household. On the evening of the Duke's death, some 40 years after that autumn day when Marian had first discovered the portrait letter, she sat in the library, that sacred space where their story had truly begun, and she placed the portrait of Thomas Ashford beside the portrait of her late husband. Between them, she positioned the original portrait letter and the marriage letter he had written her on their wedding day. And beside all of these, she placed a new document, a testament written in her own hand, to be preserved for future generations. To those who come after us, who may wonder at the strange chronicle of this household and the unusual path by which it arrived at its present state of honesty and peace, know that love, defended courageously and asserted publicly, requires no apology. Know that truth, however difficult, however costly to reveal, is always worth the price of its revelation. Know that the greatest victories are not those won through concealment and propriety, but those achieved through absolute fidelity to one's authentic self and one's authentic loves. And know that a life lived in accordance with truth, however scandalous that truth may appear to the uncomprehending eye, is infinitely more valuable than a life preserved through lies. It is my prayer that future generations will find the courage that my beloved Dorian possessed, the courage to defend not merely their own truths, but the truths of all those who have been silenced by a world that fears honesty. For in defending the truth of others, we defend our own liberty. Marian, Duchess of Rotherford, Anno Domini 1891. She closed the journal and secured it in the archive she had so carefully constructed. The portrait letters, old and new, remained visible, monuments to a love that had transcended the boundaries of death itself and had been powerful enough to transform not merely a household, but the very understanding of what love itself might mean. Outside the library windows, spring bloomed once more, indifferent to human sorrow and human triumph alike, yet somehow also participating in the eternal cycle of renewal and redemption that marks the passage of all living things. In the quiet rooms of Rutherford House, beneath the weight of accumulated secrets and the dust of years, there lived a profound truth that speaks to the deepest chambers of the human heart, that love, in whatever form it takes, when defended with courage and claimed with honesty, becomes the most redemptive force in human experience. The journey undertaken by Dorian and Marian was not one of romantic sentiment or the easy triumph of emotion over logic. Rather, it was a difficult, painful, costly assertion that the inner truth of one's being, however much society might demand its concealment, possesses a power that cannot be indefinitely suppressed. The portrait letter, hidden for years in darkness, did not lose its truth through concealment. If anything, the act of hiding it amplified the sorrow of its message, creating layers of grief that compounded across decades. Yet when that letter was finally discovered, not by the person to whom it had been written, for that was no longer possible, but by a woman who could understand its significance and defend its dignity, something extraordinary occurred. The hidden truth, exposed to light and defended with absolute courage, became not a scandal but a source of genuine transformation. It became the foundation upon which a new kind of love could be built, a love that required no concealment, that demanded no division of self, that could exist openly and honestly in the full light of day. The world teaches us that certain truths must remain hidden. It tells us that certain loves are shameful, that certain desires must be suppressed, that certain realities must be denied. Yet what Dorian and Marian understood, through the terrible education of their own suffering and their eventual defiance, was that this teaching is fundamentally false. Truth, however costly to reveal, always deserves to be honored. And a life built upon the foundation of honest self-expression, however unconventional that expression might appear to those bound by convention, is infinitely more valuable than a life preserved through careful deception. This is not to say that revelation is always beneficial, or that every truth demands to be spoken immediately and without consideration for consequence. Rather, it is to acknowledge that living in perpetual denial of one's authentic nature creates a kind of death, a slow erosion of the spirit that is far more destructive than any external consequence. And when one finds another soul brave enough to stand beside one's truth and defend it, that connection becomes something sacred, worthy of protection regardless of the world's condemnation. The portrait letters, old and new, become symbols of this transformative understanding. The first letter spoke of a love that dared not be named, a passion that demanded concealment. The second letter spoke of the same love, but liberated, transformed, redeemed through the courage to acknowledge it openly. And in that movement from silence to speech, from concealment to honesty, lies the true redemption that the story offers. We live in a world that still demands certain silences, that still insists on the concealment of inconvenient truths, that still measures human worth according to how successfully we conform to predetermined expectations. But the story of Rutherford House whispers to us a different possibility, that there is a way to live that is truer, deeper, more honest, a way that requires extraordinary courage, but that offers in return the inestimable gift of authenticity. This is the profound moral teaching that echoes through Marian and Dorian's extraordinary journey, that the courage to defend truth, both in ourselves and in others, is the highest expression of human nobility, and that love defended publicly, whatever the cost, is always worth the price of its defense. Dear beloved listeners, the story of the portrait letter and the redemptive love it illuminated has touched our hearts, as we trust it has touched yours. We invite you, no, we urge you, to become part of our growing community of those who believe in the transformative power of authentic storytelling. Subscribe to Victorian Romance audio stories and ensure that you never miss a single moment of the extraordinary narratives that await you. Each week we bring you tales of love that transcends time, of courage that defies convention, of truths that demand to be honored despite the cost of their revelation. Share your thoughts with us. Descend into our comment section and tell us, what did the portrait letter mean to you? How did Marian and Dorian's journey resonate with your own understanding of love and authenticity? What truths in your own life demand greater courage to defend? We cherish every comment, every reflection, every piece of your heart that you choose to share with us. Join our community. Become part of the conversation. For in speaking our truths to one another, in honoring the authentic journeys of others, we participate in the same redemptive work that transformed Rotherford House. We help create a world in which love, in all its forms, is defended with courage and honored with dignity. On behalf of the entire team at Victorian Romance Audio Stories, we offer our most sincere gratitude for the time you have devoted to this story. Thank you for allowing us the extraordinary privilege of narrating to you the journey of Marian and Dorian, of witnessing alongside you the transformation of a household built upon secrets into a sanctuary of truth. Your presence in this community, your engagement with these narratives, your willingness to contemplate the profound questions that they raise, all of this matters profoundly. You are the reason we continue this labor of love, week after week, year after year. You are the reason we believe that stories such as these deserve to be told and retold, for in their retelling, we participate in the collective human effort to understand ourselves and one another more deeply. With deepest appreciation and warmest regards, the Victorian Romance Audio Stories family.